My straight roommate ruined every date I had, then I caught him crying in my bed. True gay story. If this story speaks to your heart, stay with me till the end. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so these stories can keep finding the people who need them. I want to tell you something before this story starts, because if I don't say it now, you'll spend the whole thing waiting for a twist that isn't coming. This isn't a story about a man who turned out to be secretly gay all along and just needed the right guy to unlock it. Real life doesn't work like a locked door with one key. This is a story about two men who spent a year lying to themselves in the same 700 square feet, and what it finally cost them to stop. My name is Eli Bennett. I was 28 years old, working as a junior architect at a mid-sized firm downtown, and I had exactly one thing going for me in my personal life: my apartment. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors that hadn't been touched since the Clinton administration, a fire escape that looked out over a street lined with plane trees, and rent that was somehow still under $2,000 because my landlord hadn't checked the market in a decade. I was not going to give that unit up for anything, which is why, when my roommate of 3 years moved out to live with his fiancée, I panicked and put an ad up that same night. 41 people responded in 2 days. I ignored 39 of them because their profile pictures screamed, "We'll steal your Le Creuset and vanish." Person number 40 said he worked construction, kept odd hours, and needed somewhere by Friday. Person number 41 was named Caleb Ruiz. His message was 4 sentences long. "Hey, saw your listing. I'm a firefighter. 29. Quiet. Clean. Don't smoke. Can meet whenever works for you." No exclamation points. No emojis. It was the least try-hard message I'd gotten, and for some reason that made me trust him more than anyone else. We met on a Tuesday evening at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the apartment, and I remember the exact moment he walked in because the door had one of those brass bells that jingled, and every head in the place turned, including mine, and I thought, oh, that's inconvenient. Caleb Ruiz was not a conventionally beautiful man in the magazine sense. He had a nose that had clearly been broken once and healed slightly crooked, forearms roped with the kind of muscle you don't get from a gym, and a 5 o'clock shadow that looked permanent no matter what hour of day it was. But he had this way of moving through a room like he was trying to take up as little space as possible, which is a strange thing for a man his size to do, and it made you want to watch him do it. He sat down across from me, shook my hand with a grip that could have cracked a walnut, and said, "So, tell me the catch." "There's always a catch with cheap rent like that." "The catch is my last roommate got engaged and abandoned me," I said. "You're not allowed to do that." He laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him, and something in my chest did a small, stupid flip that I filed away under and ignored immediately. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me he'd been on the fire department for 6 years, that he grew up 2 states over in a house with 4 brothers and 1 bathroom, that he was, in his words, boring as hell. "I work, I lift, I sleep, I eat like a raccoon that found a kitchen." I told him I was an architect who mostly drew other people's ideas instead of my own, that I liked old buildings more than new ones, that I hadn't dated anyone seriously in over a year because my last relationship ended when my ex decided monogamy was more of a suggestion. He moved in that Saturday with 2 duffel bags, a weight bench, and a single framed photo of his mother that he set on his dresser before he unpacked anything else. I noticed that. I noted it in the same mental file where I'd put the chest flip from the coffee shop, a file I was determined to never open again. For the first few months, it was easy, almost embarrassingly easy. We fell into a rhythm the way 2 people do when neither of them is trying to perform for the other. He'd come home from a 24-hour shift smelling like smoke and exhaustion, and I'd already have dinner half made because I'd learned his schedule by week 3. I'd come home from client meetings ranting about a developer who wanted to put a strip mall next to a historic chapel, and he'd listen with the kind of focus most people reserve for emergencies, nodding at the right places, asking questions that told me he'd actually been paying attention. We watched bad television together on the couch, feet tangled under the same blanket because the apartment's heating system was a war crime. We went grocery shopping together on Sundays, and he always, without fail, tried to sneak string cheese into the cart even though I told him every single week that we already had string cheese. It should have stayed simple. It didn't, because that's the summer I started dating again, and that's when things got strange. His name was Marcus, and he was a graphic designer with a nice jaw and an even nicer laugh, and we matched on an app in July. We texted for 2 weeks before he asked me to dinner, and I remember getting ready that night with a kind of nervous hope I hadn't felt in a long time. Ironing a shirt I never iron, checking the mirror 3 separate times, generally behaving like a teenager instead of a grown man with a mortgage-adjacent rent payment. Caleb was on the couch when I came out of my room. He looked up, did a slow once-over that I told myself meant nothing, and said, "Where are you headed looking like that?" "Date," I said, trying to sound casual and mostly succeeding. "Guy named Marcus. We're doing that new Italian place on 5th. Something passed over his face. It was there and gone so fast I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A tightening around his eyes, his jaw working once like he was chewing on a word he'd decided not to say. Then it smoothed over and he said, "Have fun," in a voice that was almost too even, and went back to his phone. I should tell you what happened at that dinner because it's important for later. Marcus was charming. We had good conversation. And 40 minutes in, my phone started buzzing on the table. Not once, but 4 times in a row, the screen lighting up with Caleb's name each time. I apologized to Marcus and checked it, half expecting an emergency. "Hey, sorry, weird question. Where do you keep the fire extinguisher? I think I smell something." "NVM found it, false alarm. Actually, can you call me when you get a sec? Not urgent, but kind of is." "Never mind. Handled it, sorry. Enjoy your date." By the time I'd read all 4 texts and reassured myself the apartment wasn't on fire, which felt like a genuinely ironic way for a firefighter's home to burn down. Honestly, Marcus had that particular look men get when they realize they're competing with someone's phone. The rest of the dinner never recovered its rhythm. We said a polite goodbye on the sidewalk, and he texted the next day to say he'd had a good time but didn't think we had that spark. I couldn't even argue with him. I hadn't felt a spark with Marcus either, not really. Not the kind that made my whole body pay attention the way it did whenever Caleb walked into a room, which was a thought I shoved down so hard I nearly sprained something. I came home to find Caleb on the couch again, like he'd never left it, a bag of chips balanced on his stomach. "How was it?" he asked, not looking up from the TV. "It was fine until my roommate almost burned the apartment down," I said. He had the decency to look sheepish. "Sorry. Turned out to be nothing." Panicked. "You're a professional firefighter." "Yeah, well." He shrugged, eyes back on the screen, jaw tight in that same way. "Professionals panic too." I let it go. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself that again 3 weeks later, when a date with a nurse named Theo got interrupted by Caleb calling to ask if I'd seen his other work boot. A question that could not possibly have waited 2 hours. And again in September, when a promising second date with a teacher named Priyansh got derailed because Caleb texted to say he'd locked himself out and needed my spare key brought over immediately, only to discover, upon my rushed and apologetic exit from the restaurant, that his own key had been in his jacket pocket the whole time. "I swear I checked," he said when I got home, sounding genuinely baffled, and the worst part is I believed him. He looked as confused by his own behavior as I was. By October, I'd started joking about it with my friend Dana, because joking about it was easier than examining it. "My roommate has ruined 4 dates, I told her over drinks. At this point, I think he's sabotaging me." "Maybe he's into you," Dana said, swirling her wine like she'd just delivered the plot twist of the century. "He's straight," I said. "He's had like 3 girlfriends since I've known him. He talks about women all the time." "Does he, though?" Dana said. "Or does he talk about the idea of women, in the vague way straight men talk about sports teams they don't actually watch?" I laughed it off. I told her she was projecting a movie plot onto my actual life, and she said fine, but she wanted credit later. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 months, mostly because I made a conscious decision not to, the same way you decide not to touch a bruise so it'll stop hurting, except bruises don't work that way, and neither, it turns out, do feelings. Here's something I should have paid more attention to. Caleb did talk about women. He'd mention a girl from the gym or someone from work the way you'd mention weather, casually, generally, without follow-through. He never brought anyone home. He never went on a second date with anyone that I heard about, not once in the entire time I'd known him, despite apparently being, according to him, in some perpetual state of talking to someone. I noticed this the way you notice a pattern in wallpaper you've been looking at for years, all at once, and then you can't unsee it. It was late November, cold enough that the fire escape had a permanent skin of frost, when I finally had a date that didn't get interrupted. His name was Adrian. an ER doctor with tired, kind eyes and an easy way of making me laugh. And we made it through an entire dinner without a single text from Caleb. We went for a walk after. He kissed me at the corner of my street, gentle and unhurried, and asked if he could see me again. I said yes. I meant it, mostly. When I got upstairs, the apartment was dark except for the blue flicker of the TV, and Caleb was in the exact spot on the couch where he always was, like a fixture of the building itself. He didn't ask how it went. That was new. Usually he asked with that overly casual tone, like he was steeling himself for an answer he didn't want. Tonight he just looked at me once, said hey, and looked back at the screen. You okay? I asked. Fine, he said. Long shift. I believed him, mostly because I wanted to. I went to bed that night thinking about Adrian's mouth and telling myself that was a good sign. That whatever strange gravitational pull I felt toward my roommate was just proximity and loneliness playing tricks on me. The kind of thing that happens when you live with someone long enough that their laugh becomes part of the architecture of your day. Adrian and I saw each other 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Nothing interrupted us. No mysterious fires, no lost keys, no emergencies. I told myself Caleb had simply run out of coincidences to have. I did not let myself wonder whether he'd run out of them on purpose, whether some new resolve had settled in him and told him to stop. I found out what that resolve had cost him on a Thursday in December, at 2 a.m., when I came home from Adrian's apartment to get a change of clothes for work and found my own bedroom door open, light off, and Caleb Ruiz sitting on the edge of my bed with his face in his hands, shoulders shaking in a way I will never be able to unsee for as long as I live. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, long enough for my brain to cycle through every explanation that made sense and reject all of them. He hadn't heard me come in. The apartment door doesn't creak. Not anymore. Not since I fixed the hinge in October. A fact I remember thinking with a strange, useless clarity in that moment, the mind grasping for anything solid while the rest of it tilts sideways. Caleb? He startled so hard he nearly fell off the bed. In the half-light from the hallway I could see his face was wrecked, red-rimmed, wet, the particular kind of raw that comes from crying for a while, not just a sudden outburst. He wiped his face with the heel of his hand, fast, like he could undo it if he was quick enough. Sorry, he said, voice cracked down the middle. I thought you were staying at Adrian's. I came back for clothes. I stepped into the room slowly, the way you'd approach something wounded, because that's exactly what he looked like. Caleb, what's going on? Talk to me. Nothing. I'm fine. He stood up too fast, swaying slightly, and made a move toward the door like he was going to walk straight past me and pretend this had never happened. A maneuver I recognized because I'd used it myself more than once in my life, the emotional equivalent of running from a burning building without checking if anyone else was inside. I put my hand on his arm. Not hard, just enough to stop him. You're sitting in the dark, in my room, at 2 in the morning, crying so hard you didn't hear me come home. I said, that is not nothing. I've known you for over a year. Please don't lie to me right now. He stood there, my hand still on his arm, and I watched something in him break open. Not dramatically, not with more sobbing, but quietly, like a dam that had simply run out of structural integrity. He sat back down on the edge of the bed. I sat next to him, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and waited. I come in here sometimes, he said finally, staring at his own hands. When you're not home. I don't touch anything. This isn't as weird as it sounds, I swear. I just sit here sometimes. Your room smells like you. I don't know how to explain it better than that. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust my own voice yet. Tonight I thought you were at Adrian's, and I came in here because it's been getting worse, not better, and I thought maybe if I just, sat with it for a minute, instead of pretending. And then he gestured vaguely at his own face, at the evidence of it. It got away from me. What's been getting worse? I asked, even though some part of me already knew. Some part of me had known since the coffee shop with the brass bell, since the string cheese, since 4 ruined dates and 100 small moments I'd filed away and refused to open. He laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh. More like air escaping something under pressure. You're gonna make me say it. I think I need you to, I said, because I've spent over a year telling myself I was imagining things. And I really need to know if I was. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car alarm went off somewhere down the block and then stopped. The radiator ticked. My hand was still on his arm, and neither of us had moved to change that. I ruined your dates, he said. On purpose. Every single one except the last few because I finally made myself stop, and then I had to watch you fall for someone else instead. And I didn't have any right to be upset about that because I never said anything, because I told myself it wasn't real, because I've spent my entire life being the guy who doesn't do this, who doesn't feel this. And then I moved in here and every single thing about that plan fell apart in about 6 weeks. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were still wet, and there was so much fear in them that it made my chest hurt. I'm in love with you, Eli. I have been for a long time. I didn't want to be. I fought it. And I'm sorry for the dates, for tonight, for all of it, and I understand if you want me to move out, and I'll go tonight if that's what you... Stop, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. Stop talking for a second. He stopped. He looked terrified. The particular terror of a man who has just handed someone the most dangerous thing he owns and is waiting to see if they'll drop it. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't simple and I don't think real feelings ever are. I felt vindicated in a small, ugly way, Dana's voice in my head saying I told you so, and underneath that I felt something much bigger, a kind of vertigo, the sensation of a year's worth of buried hope surfacing all at once with nowhere to go. And underneath that, I felt scared because Adrian was a good man who deserved better than being an afterthought, and because loving your roommate is the kind of thing that either becomes the best story of your life or destroys the only stable home you've had in years. And in that bedroom at 2 in the morning, I genuinely didn't know which one this was going to be. I have to tell you something too, I said, and it's not going to make either of us feel better right away, but I need you to hear it. I felt something for you since the coffee shop, I told him. The very first day. I told myself it was ridiculous. You were my roommate. You talked about girls from the gym. You had a framed photo of your mom on your dresser and a weight bench, and you seemed like the straightest man I'd ever lived with. And I built my entire year around convincing myself I was wrong about what I was feeling, because being wrong was safer than being right and losing this apartment or this friendship or you. He was staring at me now like I'd switched languages mid-sentence. I'm seeing Adrian, I said, because it needed to be said out loud, needed to exist in the room as a real obstacle and not a comfortable abstraction. He's kind and he likes me and I like him. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that doesn't matter, or that I can just erase it because you cried in my bed at 2 in the morning and said something I've apparently been waiting a year to hear. I know, Caleb said quietly. I know that. I'm not asking you to erase anything. I just couldn't keep lying anymore. I didn't plan for you to catch me like this. I didn't plan any of this. I need time, I said. Not because I don't feel it back, God, Caleb, I feel it back. I think I've felt it back since the day you walked through that door and everyone in the coffee shop looked up. But because I'm not going to build something real on top of a mess I made by being a coward for a year. I have to be honest with Adrian. And you have to actually figure out what this means for you, not just in a 2 in the morning, caught crying, adrenaline kind of way, but in the daylight, sober, thinking clearly kind of way. Because if this is real, I need it to survive daylight. I've had enough things in my life that only worked in the dark. He nodded slowly, and something in his face shifted from raw panic into something steadier. Something that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of a man who expected to be thrown out of a burning building and instead was handed a rope. Can I ask you something? He said. Yeah. The dates. Were you ever... Did any of them mean anything? Or was some part of you always doing what I was doing? Running interference on your own life? I thought about that honestly because he deserved honesty after what it had cost him to give me his. Some of them meant something small, I said. Adrian means something real, and that's exactly why I can't just brush him off in one conversation at 2 in the morning because you finally said the thing out loud. But if I'm being honest with you the way you were honest with me, no. None of them ever felt like this. Whatever this is. I think some part of me was always coming home to you, even on the nights I didn't. He let out a breath like he'd been holding it since July. I won't pretend the next 3 weeks were easy because they weren't, and I think it would be dishonest to tell you they were, given everything else I've tried to be honest about in this story. I called Adrian the next day. Not over text because he deserved better than that, and not in person either because I didn't trust myself to say what needed saying if I was looking at his kind, tired eyes while I said it. I told him the truth. Not all of it. Not the 2 in the morning specifics, but enough. That I had unresolved feelings for someone else. Feelings I hadn't been honest with myself about. And that it wasn't fair to either of us for me to keep dating him while those feelings sat there unexamined. I figured something was going on, Adrian said, and he didn't sound angry, just tired in a different way than usual. You always had one foot out the door. I hoped I was wrong. He wished me well. I meant it when I told him I hoped the same for him, and I've heard since, through a mutual friend, that he's doing just fine, which is the ending I wanted for him even if it wasn't the ending we got together. Caleb and I didn't talk about us, not really, not for those 3 weeks. We agreed, mutually carefully like two people setting the terms of a truce, that we'd let things breathe. He worked his shifts. I finished a project at the firm that had been eating my evenings for a month. We still made dinner together most nights, still sat under the same terrible blanket in front of the TV. But there was a new kind of electricity in the apartment now, the kind you get right before a storm, when the air itself seems to know something's coming. I watched him in those weeks the way you watch someone you're allowed to actually see for the first time. I noticed he'd stopped mentioning girls from the gym entirely. I noticed the way he found small reasons to be in the same room as me. Reading on the other end of the couch instead of in his own bed. Finding chores to do in the kitchen while I cooked. I noticed, one Tuesday, that he'd bought the good coffee, the brand I liked and he'd always complained was overpriced, without saying a word about it. On the 21st night, a Friday, he came home from a shift, showered off the smoke smell, and found me on the fire escape with 2 beers, because that's where I went when I needed to think and the December cold felt honest in a way indoor warmth didn't. He climbed out to join me without being asked, folding his long frame onto the metal grating across from me, close enough that our knees touched. I've had 3 weeks to think about it, like you asked, he said. In the daylight. Sober. All of it. And I'm still here, he said. Every morning I wake up and I think, okay, today's the day this stops feeling true. Today the fear wins and I go back to being the guy who dates girls from the gym he never calls back. And it hasn't happened. Not once. I don't think it's going to. I think I've just been the same guy this whole time, Eli. And you're the first person who ever made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise. I looked at him for a long moment, at the crooked nose, the permanent 5 o'clock shadow, the particular way he held himself like he was trying to take up less space than he deserved to take. And I thought about the coffee shop and the string cheese, and 4 ruined dates that I now understood weren't sabotage so much as a man drowning quietly in a feeling he didn't have language for yet. I'm still here too, I said. I have been the whole time. I was just waiting for daylight. He reached over and laced his fingers through mine on the cold metal grating. And neither of us said anything else for a while, because some things don't need narrating, they just need to be allowed to happen. Below us, the plane trees on Larkin Street stood bare against the streetlights, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at nothing. And it was, without question, the most ordinary and the most important moment of my entire year. He kissed me first. I'd wondered, in idle moments over the past year, what that would be like, and none of my idle guessing came close. It wasn't fireworks, it wasn't cinematic, it was warm and a little clumsy, and it tasted like the good coffee he'd bought without saying why. And it felt, more than anything, like coming home to an apartment I'd already been living in for a year without knowing it. I'm writing this from the same fire escape, if you're wondering. Though the apartment looks different now, we finally fixed the heating, for one thing, so the terrible blanket has been retired to a closet, a casualty of comfort. Caleb still works his 24-hour shifts. I still complain about developers who want to put strip malls next to historic chapels. Dana still brings up, roughly once a month, that she called it before either of us did, and she's not wrong to, so I let her have it. We didn't get some Hollywood ending where the sky opened up and everything was easy from that point forward. We had hard conversations after that night on the fire escape, about what it meant for him to come out to his family, about what it meant for me to trust someone again after building a year of walls, about the ordinary friction of 2 people learning how to be honest with each other after so much practice at not being. But we had them. That's the part that matters. We stopped ruining each other's chances at happiness by accident and started building it on purpose instead. He still keeps that photo of his mother on the dresser. There's a second frame next to it now, one I gave him for his birthday. A photo from the coffee shop, actually, the one Dana snapped without either of us noticing on the night we finally admitted the truth to each other on that fire escape. He says it's his favorite thing in the apartment. I believe him because I feel the same way about the space we built out of a year of lying and one honest, terrible, beautiful night when I caught my roommate crying in my bed and finally understood why. If there's anything I want you to take from this, and I know these stories usually end with some kind of lesson, so here's mine. It's that the people who seem the most certain of who they're supposed to be are sometimes the ones fighting the hardest against who they actually are. Caleb wasn't hiding from me. He was hiding from himself, the same way I was, and it took both of us finally running out of places to hide before we found each other in the one room we'd been avoiding the whole time. We're still in that apartment on Larkin Street. The rent's gone up a little. We don't mind. If the story moved you, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more true-style love stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more where this came from. My straight roommate ruined every date I had. Part 2, what came after. Nobody warns you that the hardest part isn't the confession on the fire escape. The hardest part is the Tuesday after. The dishes still need doing. The rent is still due on the 1st. You still have to figure out, in the unglamorous light of a regular morning, how to be two people who used to be careful roommates and are now something else entirely, without either of you tripping over the new shape of the apartment. The first morning after we officially became a couple. Not the fire escape night itself, but the actual next morning, the one where I woke up in my own bed alone because we hadn't rushed anything, and walked out to find Caleb already up making eggs like it was any other day. Neither of us knew quite how to stand in the kitchen together. Morning, he said, and then, after a beat, like he was testing whether the word still applied, do you want coffee? I made the good kind again. You've made the good kind of 3 days running, I said. I think the secret's out. You like it too. I have never once complained about the coffee, he said, sliding a plate toward me. You complained about the coffee for 11 months. That was a bit. It was not a bit, Caleb. You called it poverty juice for people who hate themselves. He laughed. That same surprised laugh from the coffee shop, over a year old now and somehow still capable of doing the same stupid thing to my chest, and something in the kitchen loosened. We ate breakfast standing at the counter like we always had, except now every so often his hand would find the small of my back or mine would land on his forearm. Small experimental touches, the two of us learning a new language out of the same alphabet we'd been using as friends for a year. It took us about 3 weeks to stop being self-conscious about it. 3 weeks of overly polite "is this okay?" and careful distance in doorways until one night I got frustrated with the caution and just pulled him down onto the couch by his shirt collar mid-sentence, and he laughed against my mouth and said, "Oh, thank God. I thought we were going to tiptoe around each other until we died," and after that the tiptoeing mostly stopped. Mostly. Old habits don't die in a single dramatic scene, no matter what television teaches you. They die in 100 small, unremarkable moments, most of which nobody bothers to write down. I'm writing a few of them down now because I think they mattered more than the fire escape did, honestly, even if the fire escape makes a better story. I found out how many Ruiz brothers there were the hard way, which is to say all 4 of them called Caleb within the same hour on a Sunday in February, and he answered every single one standing in our kitchen with his back to me, voice dropping into a register I hadn't heard before, careful, a little braced, like a man testing ice before he puts his full weight on it. He hadn't told them yet. He told me that early on the fire escape in one of those hard conversations I mentioned, that his family was close in the loud, overlapping way of people who grew up sharing one bathroom, and that closeness had never once been tested by anything harder than someone dating a person the others didn't like. He didn't know what it would do to that closeness to test it with this. You don't owe them a timeline, I told him that night, drying a pot he'd washed and handed to me without looking. You get to do this when you're ready, not when it's convenient for the story. I know, he said. I just keep picturing my mom's face. Not because I think she'll hate me. I don't think she will. I just don't know what her face is going to do, and not knowing is worse than knowing something bad, if that makes sense. It made perfect sense. I'd spent a year not knowing what my own face would do if I let it show the truth, and the not knowing had cost us both 4 ruined dates and a lot of unnecessary suffering. I didn't say that out loud. I didn't need to. He knew. He decided to start with Danny, the youngest, because Danny had always been the brother he trusted most with anything fragile. He called him on a Wednesday night while I sat in the next room pretending to read, close enough to be there if he needed me and far enough to give him privacy, which is a strange kind of hovering, but it was the only kind that felt right. I heard the tail end of it through the wall. Not the words, just the shape of them. The long pause after Caleb said something short, and then the sound of him laughing, wet and relieved, and I knew before he came back into the room that it had gone all right. He said, and I quote, "Caleb told me, dropping onto the couch next to me with the specific limpness of a man who's been holding his breath for an hour. Okay, cool. Does this mean I don't have to pretend to like the guy from the gym you kept talking about, because I never believed that guy existed?" Did the guy from the gym exist? There was a guy at the gym. I did not talk to him beyond, "Can I work in?" So Danny called it. Danny, Caleb said, with the particular disgust of an older brother, has never called anything correctly in his entire life, and I resent that this is the one time he did. The other two middle brothers went almost as smoothly, each call a little easier than the last, the way anything gets easier once you've survived it once. It was his mother he saved for last, and he saved her for in person on a trip he took alone because he said if it went badly he didn't want me watching it happen, and if it went well he wanted to be the one who got to tell me, not have me standing there as evidence either way. It went well. Not instantly. Not without a few days of his mother needing quiet to reorganize 29 years of assumptions. A silence Caleb described to me over the phone each night with the anxious precision of a man reporting from a country whose language he'd only partly learned. But well, in the end. He called me from a gas station outside his hometown at 11 at night, and I could hear in his voice that something structural had shifted in him. Some tension he'd been carrying since long before I met him finally set down. "She wants to meet you," he said. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly, "Well, bring him around. I want to see the man who finally got you to stop lying to me." "That's terrifying," I said. Yeah, he agreed. I'm still not over it either. I flew out in June. Caleb picked me up from the airport in a truck that had clearly belonged to someone in his family for 2 decades longer than it had belonged to him, and he was more nervous in that 40-minute drive than I'd ever seen him on an actual fire call, which he'd taken me to visit once, so I had a baseline for comparison. "You don't have to perform anything," I told him, my hand on his knee while he drove past fields I didn't recognize the names of. "I like you. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens in that house, we leave it in that house and we still have each other in the truck." He exhaled like that had been the exact sentence he needed and hadn't known how to ask for. Marian Ruiz turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman who hugged me for slightly longer than a first hug usually lasts and then held me at arm's length to study my face the way you'd study a blueprint for a house you were about to live in. "So you're the architect," she said. "I am. Good. This family needs someone who can fix things instead of just complaining they're broken." She looked past me at Caleb, who was hovering in the doorway like a man not fully convinced the floor would hold his weight. "Come inside. Both of you. Dinner's getting cold and your brother's already ate half the rice waiting for you to work up the nerve to walk in." Dinner was loud in the specific way I imagined it would be. For brothers talking over each other. A father who said little but watched everything with an attentiveness that reminded me a little of Caleb. Plates passed hand to hand without anyone asking. Nobody made it strange. Nobody made a speech about acceptance, which I was grateful for, because I've always found those speeches say more about the person giving them than the person they're supposedly for. Danny spent most of dinner trying to convince me that Caleb had once cried during a commercial for a phone company. A claim Caleb denied so vehemently that I knew immediately it was true. "It was a good commercial," Caleb muttered into his plate. "It was a phone plan," Danny said. "There was a dog in it for 4 seconds. The dog was very good." The whole table dissolved into laughter, and I sat there in the middle of it feeling something settle in my chest that I hadn't fully realized was unsettled. A kind of permission I didn't know I'd been waiting for. The sense that I wasn't a guest being tolerated but a person being folded into something that already existed. The way you fold a new ingredient into a dish that was already good on its own. Later that night, on the back porch, Marian sat next to me while Caleb helped his father with something in the garage that didn't actually need help. The universal excuse of men who need 5 minutes alone to compose themselves. "He was a serious kid," she said, not looking at me, looking out at the yard instead, where the light was doing that particular deep gold thing summer evenings do right before they give up entirely. Serious about everything. Serious about being good, being reliable, being the one you could count on. I used to worry that seriousness would end up being a cage instead of a virtue. She turned to look at me then, and her eyes were exactly like Caleb's, which I hadn't expected, the same steadiness underneath. "You're the first thing I've seen let him put it down for 5 minutes. I noticed it at dinner." He laughed with his whole face. "I haven't seen him do that since he was maybe 19. I didn't have a smooth answer for that. I just said, he does that to me too. I didn't know I was doing it that tightly until he loosened it. She patted my knee once, decisively, the way you'd close a file you were satisfied with. Good, she said again, and went back inside to yell at one of her sons about the dishes, and I sat on that porch alone for another minute or two just breathing it in, the strange good luck of having landed, somehow, in a family that made room instead of drawing lines. I don't want to give you the impression that the year after that fire escape was one long unbroken climb toward happiness, because it wasn't, and I promised you honesty in the first half of this story, so I'll keep the promise here too. We fought about ordinary things. He left wet towels on the bathroom floor with a consistency that felt almost like a hobby, like he was conducting some kind of long-term study on how long a towel could stay damp on hardwood before someone snapped. I had a habit of going quiet when I was upset instead of saying what was wrong. A habit I'd built over years of relationships where saying what was wrong hadn't gotten me anywhere except further ignored, and Caleb, used to a house of 4 brothers who solved things loudly and immediately, who yelled and then hugged 20 minutes later like nothing had happened, found my silence more frustrating than anything he could have said back to actual yelling. I need you to just tell me, he said once in October after I'd spent 2 days short with him over something he genuinely hadn't known he'd done. A comment at a dinner with his coworkers that had landed wrong, that he hadn't even clocked landing wrong until I'd gone cold for 2 days straight. I can't fix a door I don't know is closed. I'm not used to anyone actually wanting to open it, I admitted, sitting across from him at our kitchen table, the good coffee going cold between us because neither of us had touched it in the tension. In my head, going quiet was the polite version of leaving. I didn't want to leave. I just didn't know how to stay and still say the truth. Then say it badly, he said. Say it wrong, say it clumsy, I don't care. I'd rather have you say it wrong than not say it at all. I spent a year not saying things and look how well that went for both of us. That landed the way it needed to. We worked on it after that. Not perfectly, not in one conversation because habits built over a lifetime don't dissolve because someone points at them once, but in the unglamorous, daily way that never makes it into anyone's highlight reel. Naming things out loud even when my throat wanted to close around them, apologizing without qualifying the apology into nothing, choosing each other again on the boring Tuesdays as much as we had on the fire escape night that everybody would rather hear about. There was a bad week in the spring, the worst one, when a client project of mine collapsed after 8 months of work over a developer's cold feet, and I came home and said almost nothing for 4 straight days, not because I was angry at Caleb but because I didn't have language for the specific kind of grief that comes from watching something you built get abandoned before it existed. He didn't push. He also didn't disappear. He just kept showing up, leaving a plate of food by my laptop without comment, sitting near me on the couch without demanding conversation, one night just lying down next to me on the bed at 8 in the evening and saying nothing at all, just being a warm, solid weight next to my spine until I finally, on the 5th night, cried about the project in a way I hadn't let myself do yet, and he held on and didn't say anything wise or fix anything, just stayed. You don't have to talk, he said into my hair. You just have to stay in the room. That's the whole ask. I thought about the 4 ruined dates, the year of both of us not staying in the room in one way or another, and I thought, we're getting better at this. Slowly, unevenly, but better. Dana, for her part, remained insufferable about having called it first, and eventually I stopped fighting her on it and just bought her a drink every time she brought it up, which turned out to be cheaper in the long run than the arguing had been. I want it noted for the record, she said once, that I predicted this in October of last year, unprompted over cheap wine, and nobody believed me. You've had this noted for the record roughly 40 times. I intend to have it noted 40 more. He proposed in the stupidest, most Caleb way possible, which is to say I found the ring by accident because he'd hidden it in his fire department turnout gear bag, a place he correctly assumed I would never willingly go looking for anything, except one Tuesday I needed to borrow his multi-tool and grabbed the wrong bag off the hook by the door. I stood in the hallway holding a small black box I had absolutely no business opening, and opened it anyway, because I am only human and there are limits to anyone's restraint, particularly at 8 in the morning before coffee. I did not get to have a private moment of shock about it, because Caleb walked out of the kitchen at exactly that moment, saw me standing there with the box open in my hand, and made a sound I can only describe as the noise a smoke detector makes when you've burned toast. That was supposed to happen at the restaurant on Friday, he said, somewhere between horrified and resigned, crossing the hallway in 2 strides like he could somehow unhappen the last 5 seconds. I had a whole thing planned. There was going to be a violin. There's a violin? There was going to be a violin, he said. I don't know what happens to the violin plan now. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I was mid-plan when you apparently decided to go through my bag like a customs agent. I needed the multi-tool. You could have asked me for the multi-tool. You were in the shower, Caleb. I wasn't going to interrupt a man's shower to ask for a screwdriver. We stood in the hallway of the apartment on Larkin Street. The same hallway, the same building, the heating finally fixed, the terrible blanket long retired to a closet. And I started laughing, and then he started laughing, the particular helpless laughing of two people whose careful plans have just collapsed into something better than the plan ever was. Somewhere in the middle of that laughing, he took the box gently out of my hand, got down on one knee on our objectively unglamorous hardwood floor that hadn't been refinished since the Clinton administration, and asked me anyway, ruined surprise and all. I had better words prepared, he said, and his hands actually were shaking, which somehow made the whole ambushed moment feel more real than the violin ever would have. They're somewhere in a notes app one can't access right now because my hands are shaking. So you're just going to get the real version. I've loved you since I ruined the first date I ever ruined on purpose, and I've spent every day since figuring out how to stop being scared of the size of that. I'm not scared anymore. Marry me. Yes, I said, before he'd even fully finished the sentence, because some questions don't require you to wait for the last word. We never did get the violin. We got a slightly bent hallway proposal with a stolen multi-tool still in my other hand, and I wouldn't trade it for the version with strings attached, literally or otherwise. When I told Dana how it happened, she laughed so hard she had to put her wine down, and then she said, honestly, that tracks. That man has never once managed to execute a plan around you correctly, and somehow it's always worked out better for it. She wasn't wrong. We got married the following spring, in his mother's backyard, under a tree that Danny climbed halfway up during the reception on a dare, and then couldn't figure out how to climb back down from, which felt appropriately on brand for the Ruiz family and provided roughly 20 minutes of unplanned entertainment while his brothers argued about the best way to get him down without anyone breaking an ankle. Dana caught the bouquet and pretended it meant nothing to her while absolutely keeping it pressed in a book afterward, a fact I know for certain because I saw the book. Marion cried through the entire ceremony, unapologetically, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief that I'm fairly sure had belonged to Caleb's grandmother, and afterward she hugged me again, that same too-long hug from our first meeting, and said, well, now you're stuck with all of us officially, in a tone that made it very clear she considered this an excellent outcome for everyone involved. We still live on Larkin Street, though we finally bought the unit outright last year when the building went co-op, which felt like closing some kind of loop. The apartment that almost went to a stranger with a suspicious profile picture instead became the place we built an entire life inside of, brick and hardwood and one fixed hinge at a time. Caleb still works his shifts. I made partner at the firm last winter, and one of the first things I did with the extra income was commission a real architect's rendering, my own idea for once, not somebody else's, of a small chapel restoration, the same kind of building I used to fight developers over, and hung it in the hallway where the multi-tool incident happened because I thought the hallway deserved something nice after what we put it through. The photo from the coffee shop still sits on his dresser, next to his mother's picture, both frames a little worn now from being moved between rooms and dusted 1,000 times. Some nights I still catch him looking at it before he falls asleep, and when I ask what he's thinking, he says some version of the same thing every time. Just glad I ran out of places to hide, he says. Glad you were still standing there when I did. I tell him I was always going to be standing there. I just needed daylight to prove it to both of us. We're still in that apartment on Larkin Street. The rent doesn't matter anymore, not the way it used to, not since we own the walls instead of borrowing them. But some habits don't change just because the circumstances do. We still eat dinner under the same terrible blankets replacement, still argue about towels, still sit on the fire escape some nights with 2 beers and nothing in particular to say, just the plain trees and the streetlights and each other, which turns out to be enough and always was, even back when neither of us would admit it out loud. Thanks for watching part 2. Let me know in the comments what you'd want to see if there's a part 3. Subscribed readers get first access to new chapters.